Shout at me again, and I'll end you." She didn't whisper it. She said it loud in front of his entire Mafia family. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say. It happened on Christmas Day in the middle of the most expensive restaurant in the city. One woman, one moment, one sentence. Nobody could believe what she just did. But what happened next? No one was ready for that. Hey, my beautiful family. Welcome back to the channel. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from today? Is it the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, maybe the United States of America? Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're here. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. We've got real stories, deep emotions, and powerful lessons every week. Now, sit back, relax, and let's step into the world of one woman. One moment, one sentence, and the day everything changed. What if I told you that sometimes the person you scream at is the only one who could have saved you? For 7 long years, Sofia Rodriguez had carried the world on her shoulders. And most days, no one even noticed. She wasn't rich. She wasn't famous. But every morning before the city woke up, she tied her apron, smiled in the mirror, and walked into Bella Vista, the fanciest restaurant in town, like her life depended on it. Because it did. She worked double shifts, holidays, birthdays, even on days when her feet bled and her heart broke. All for one reason: her family. Her mother had been sick for months. Bills were piling up. Her little siblings still needed food, school shoes, and someone who showed up. And Sofia, she showed up every day, even when no one clapped, even when no one asked if she was okay. But there was one thing she begged for. One thing she circled on the calendar with hope. Christmas off. Just one day. To rest. One day to laugh with her siblings. One day to sit next to her mom and feel like a daughter, not a nurse, not a provider, just a daughter. But at 6:12 a.m. on Christmas morning, that wish shattered. Her mother collapsed in the hallway. By 6:45, they were rushing to the emergency room. By 7:30, Sofia was holding a clipboard with a hospital bill she couldn't pay. And by 9 a.m., she was tying her apron again. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. An emergency triple shift on Christmas Day. While her mother lay in the hospital, while her siblings waited alone at home, Sofia looked at herself in the mirror, pale, shaking, exhausted. But she still whispered, "Just survive today. You've survived worse." Then she stepped into the dining hall and walked straight into the one table she never wanted to serve. The Torino family Christmas banquet. Gold garlands draped over the chandeliers. Strings of violin music played softly from the speakers. Crystal glasses sparkled under warm lights, and laughter floated through the air like expensive perfume. In the center of it all sat Marco Torino, the heir to a criminal empire, dressed in black like a warning sign. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Everyone knew who he was. Handsome in the way danger always is. Sharp jaw, sharper eyes, and a presence that made the room quieter without him saying a word. Sofia kept her eyes low and her hands steady. She had served him before once. That was enough. He didn't shout that time, but he didn't say thank you either. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. Only spoke when he wanted something and snapped when it didn't arrive fast enough. Now, with his entire family gathered around a 10-foot table, plates of imported seafood and lamb laid out like treasure, Marco lifted his wine glass, sipped once, then slammed it to the table so hard the utensils rattled. "It's warm," he barked. His voice cut through the music, through the hum of chatter, through Sofia's spine. "Did I ask for tea?" "This is wine," I said. The manager hurried over, stuttering an apology. A server from the bar froze mid-step. Nobody moved. Marco's gaze didn't leave the wine glass. His fingers tapped the stem, slow and sharp. Is everyone here deaf, or just stupid? Sofia stood 5 feet away, clutching the breadbasket like it might protect her. Fingers ached from carrying heavy trays all morning. Her head pulsed from stress and hunger. But this tone, this voice, like she wasn't human. "Bring him another glass," someone whispered. But before she could move, he snapped his fingers at her. "You," he said, "don't just stand there. Bring the bottle yourself. And don't take forever this time." Heat crawled up her neck. Behind her eyes, something stung. Her breath caught in her chest, but she didn't blink, didn't cry. Then he spoke again. Louder, sharper, crueler. "What are you waiting for, waitress?" And just like that, something inside her cracked. Sofia set the breadbasket down with calm, deliberate hands. Her body was shaking, but her voice came out steady. She stepped forward just enough for the entire table to see her and looked Marco Torino dead in the eyes. His family turned toward her slowly, expressions sliding from amusement to confusion. The servers froze. The violin music kept playing like it didn't realize what was about to happen. Sophia's voice cut through it all. "Shout at me again." Her eyes didn't blink. Her hands clenched at her sides, her whole chest burning. "And I'll end you." The room stopped breathing. Forks hovered midair. Glasses stilled. One of Marco's cousins looked like he might slide under the table. Even the manager took a step back, eyes wide, mouth half open. No one had ever spoken to Marco Torino like that. Not in public, not in private, not ever. Marco didn't move. He didn't blink. His jaw flexed once, but his eyes never left hers. He stood slowly. The chair legs scraped against the floor, loud in the silence. Sophia didn't flinch. Marco looked around the table, then down at her again, not with rage, not with fury, but with something colder, something unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the restaurant. Sophia stood there, heart thudding, unsure if she'd just ruined her life or taken it back. No one spoke. No one dared. Minutes later, she was clocking out early, barely able to keep her legs under her. She walked straight to the hospital, still in her uniform, the cold biting through her thin coat. Her mother was asleep, machines beeping softly beside the bed. Sophia sat beside her, head in her hands, guilt crawling under her skin. She should have been here. She should have found another way. But beneath the exhaustion and fear, something else flickered quietly in her chest. For once, she hadn't let someone walk all over her. Across the city, Marco Torino sat alone in his penthouse, untouched food on the table, wine glass still full. He couldn't get her face out of his head, the fire in her eyes the way she didn't flinch. He'd been screamed at before, challenged, disrespected. But this felt different. He opened his laptop and started digging. He found her name, Sofia Rodriguez, age 26. No criminal record, no scandals, just a stack of hospital visits under her insurance history and recent emergency shifts logged through the Bella Vista scheduling system. He leaned back, breathing out slowly. Her mother was sick. She worked through Christmas. She wasn't angry at the wine. She was drowning. And the way she spoke to him, firm, shaking, but still brave, it tugged something loose inside him. Something he hadn't felt in years. Why did her voice sound like my mother's once did before we buried her? That question stayed with him all night. He didn't sleep, didn't touch his phone. By morning, he was standing outside her apartment building, hands in his coat pockets, no driver, no guards, just him. The streets were still wet from last night's rain. The sky had dull gray. When Sophia opened her door and saw him, her face went blank. He didn't speak right away. He just nodded once like a man showing respect. "I came to apologize," he said quietly. Sophia didn't blink. She slammed the door. He came back the next day. Then again the day after that. No gifts, no pressure, no suits, just a man standing in the cold, waiting to be heard. Eventually, she opened the door halfway. "Why are you here?" she asked, tired. He looked her in the eye. "Because I was wrong," he said. "And because you didn't deserve what I gave you." She didn't invite him in, but she didn't close the door either. So he talked slowly. "Care carefully. My father died 2 days before Christmas," he said, voice low. "The funeral was private. I buried him alone. No speeches, no family." He rubbed the back of his neck like the words cost him something. He was the Dawn, feared by everyone, including me. I hated him. I still do. But when he was gone, I didn't know what to do with all that anger, so I threw it at you." Sophia didn't say anything. Not at first, but she didn't close the door. A few days later, they met at a small corner coffee shop. No suits, no titles, just two people sitting across from each other trying to find the edges of their own mess. The first few conversations were tense, clipped. He apologized again. She didn't make it easy, but she listened. And when she spoke, he did, too. Over time, phone calls replaced silence. Their arguments turned into banter. "You're still arrogant," she'd say. "You're still fearless," he'd reply. The walls between them didn't crumble. They were taken down piece by piece. Then one day, the hospital called with unexpected news. Sophia's mother's treatments were fully covered. No explanation. No invoice. Just paid. She knew. Instantly, she stormed into the same coffee shop, her eyes blazing. "Did you do it?" He didn't deny it. You should have asked me first. She snapped. I don't need your pity. He stood calm, but serious. It wasn't pity. It was the least I could do. She didn't forgive him right away, but she sat back down. She wanted to understand him. That's when he told her what no one else knew. I was born into power I never wanted. My father raised me to be feared, not loved. Every choice I make feels like it belongs to him, not me. His voice cracked slightly. But the day you stood up to me, that was the first time I saw another way. His words were still hanging between them when everything around them started to tighten. The Torino family wasn't blind. They saw the shift in Marco, the softness creeping into a man who was never supposed to have any. His uncle, the consolier, who had advised 2 dons, cornered him in the study of the family estate, voice low and sharp like a blade. She's making you soft, Marco. And soft men die. Marco didn't answer, but his silence wasn't agreement. It was warning. Meanwhile, Sophia began noticing strange things at Bella Vista. A man in a dark coat sitting at table 9 for hours without ordering. A note slipped under a tray. He doesn't belong with you. A corker whispering that 2 unfamiliar men had asked what time she finished her shift. Sophia tried to hide it, but Marco saw the fear in her eyes the moment she walked into the coffee shop. He didn't ask questions. He already knew. That night, he walked into the Torino estate alone. No bodyguards, no hesitation. His uncle stepped forward, ready to lecture again, but Marco's voice was ice. Touch her again, and I'll burn this family to the ground. No yelling, no threats layered in anger, just certainty, deadly and calm. The room went silent. Men who feared nothing suddenly feared him. After that, Marco moved quietly, cutting ties, shifting power, sealing accounts, dismantling control piece. By the time the family realized what he was doing, he was already gone, and he wasn't going back. 1 year later, on Christmas night, the banquet hall at Bella Vista looked nothing like it did before. No long Mafia table, no gold chains, no loud voices or snapping fingers. Just soft music, warm lights, and a single table set for 2. Marco stood by the entrance, straightening his cuffs. But there was no suit today, just a quiet black shirt and eyes that had learned how to look at someone without needing control. Sophia walked in slowly, her hair tucked back, her uniform traded for a soft red dress. She was still tired. Between part-time shifts and nursing school, sleep came in pieces. But tonight, her eyes were calm. Marco pulled out her chair without a word. She sat. He joined her. No crowd, no noise, just peace. The food was simple. The room was quiet. And after a while, when the lights dimmed and the candles burned low, he reached into his coat pocket, then looked her in the eyes. Last Christmas, he said, voice steady. You yelled at me and saved my life. He paused. This Christmas, I want to spend the rest of my life protecting yours. Sophia didn't speak. She didn't need to. She leaned forward, and he met her halfway. A kiss. Quiet, certain, nothing like the chaos that brought them here. Then a toast, glasses raised in silence, eyes locked, a promise sealed without ceremony. Sometimes the loudest changes come from the quietest moments. Sometimes the smallest act of defiance becomes someone else's salvation. If you've ever had to stand up to someone powerful, tell us your story in the comments. And remember, courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just says no more. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch your heart and remind you that strength can come from anyone, even a waitress on Christmas. But their story was just beginning. The months that followed tested everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the price of breaking free from a world built on violence. Sophia threw herself into nursing school with the same determination that had carried her through 7 years of double shifts. The textbooks felt heavy in her hands, not from their weight, but from the weight of possibility they represented. For the first time in her life, she was studying for herself, not just surviving for others. Her mother's recovery was slow but steady. The treatments Marco had quietly arranged were working, giving Sophia's family something they hadn't had in years, hope. Her siblings started asking about college applications instead of asking when Sophia would be home from work. The change was everything Sophia had dreamed of, but it came with complications she hadn't expected. The other nursing students whispered about her whenever she walked into class. Word had spread somehow that she was connected to Marco Torino, and the whispers followed her through hospital corridors during clinical rotations. Some whispers were fearful, others curious, but all of them reminded her that she could never fully escape the shadow of the world Marco was trying to leave behind. Marco faced his own struggles with the transition. Leaving the family business wasn't as simple as walking away. There were debts to be settled, territories to be transferred, and enemies who saw his departure as weakness to be exploited. His uncle's warnings proved prophetic when the Castellano family made their move 3 months after Marco's withdrawal from active leadership. They targeted Sofia's apartment building first, thinking intimidation would bring Marco back to the negotiating table. They were wrong. Marco's response was swift and decisive, but it wasn't the old Marco who responded with immediate violence. Instead, he used the network of legitimate businesses he'd been quietly building, the security consulting firm that employed many of his former associates, the import company that gave them legal income, the real estate investments that provided clean money. Within a week, the Castellanos found their operations disrupted at every level. Shipments delayed, permits revoked, key personnel suddenly deciding to work elsewhere. It was a masterclass in modern warfare, fought with lawyers and accountants instead of guns and threats. But the message was clear: Sofia Rodriguez was under protection, and that protection had teeth. Sofia watched this unfold with a mixture of admiration and concern. She saw how Marco handled the crisis without falling back into old patterns, how he protected her without asking her to hide or run. But she also saw the cost. The stress carved new lines around his eyes, and she caught him staring out windows as if expecting threats that never materialized. One evening, as they sat in the coffee shop that had become their sanctuary, Sofia reached across the table and took his hand. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore," she said quietly. "I'm not the same woman you met a year ago. I'm stronger now, and I understand your world better. Let me help." Marco's first instinct was to refuse, to insist that keeping her separate from his problems was the only way to keep her safe. But when he looked into her eyes, he saw something that stopped his protest before it began. Sofia wasn't asking to be protected anymore. She was offering to be a partner. The shift changed everything between them. Sofia started attending the meetings where Marco discussed security for his legitimate businesses. Her perspective, shaped by years of watching how ordinary people navigated dangerous situations, proved invaluable. She understood things that Marco's former associates missed: how to read the fear in a server's eyes, how to spot when someone was being pressured by outside forces, how to build trust in communities that had learned to be suspicious of authority. Together, they developed a different kind of power structure. Instead of ruling through fear, they built networks through protection and opportunity. Marco's security firm began offering free services to small businesses in neighborhoods where the old crime families had operated. Sofia organized healthcare clinics in the same communities, using connections she'd made during nursing school. They weren't trying to replace the old system with something identical. They were building something entirely new. The work was dangerous in different ways. Several times, attempts were made to intimidate Sofia directly. Once, a man approached her outside the hospital where she was completing her clinical rotation, suggesting that her boyfriend's protection might not extend to all hours of the day. Sofia looked him in the eye and said quietly, "You should probably check with your boss before making threats you can't back up." Then she walked away, heart pounding but voice steady. When Marco heard about the incident, his immediate reaction was rage. Sofia had to physically stop him from leaving the apartment to hunt down the man who'd threatened her. Instead, she convinced him to let her handle it her way. The next day, Sofia showed up at the man's workplace, a small auto repair shop in Queens. She didn't threaten him or his boss. Instead, she offered free health screenings for all the shop's employees, mentioning casually that she'd noticed the owner seemed to have a persistent cough that might need looking into. The message was subtle but clear. She could help or she could withdraw her help, but either way, she wasn't someone to be dismissed or intimidated. The threat stopped. Sofia's approach became their standard strategy. Instead of responding to challenges with overwhelming force, they responded with overwhelming value. When the Ruiz family tried to muscle in on Marco's shipping operations, Sofia organized a job fair that offered better employment opportunities to anyone willing to leave the Ruiz payroll. When corrupt city officials tried to shut down their community clinics, Marco's lawyers filed so many legitimate complaints about regulatory violations in the officials' other dealings that the bureaucrats decided cooperation was preferable to continued warfare. It took 2 years to fully establish their new paradigm, but by the end of that time, they had built something unprecedented in the history of organized crime in their city. A network that provided protection and opportunity without demanding absolute loyalty or threatening violence against those who chose different paths. Sophia graduated from nursing school at the top of her class, despite the challenges of building an empire alongside her studies. Marco was there in the audience when she walked across the stage, wearing a simple black suit instead of the expensive designer clothing that had once defined his public image. In the photos from that day, he looked like any other proud boyfriend celebrating his partner's achievement. No one looking at those pictures would have guessed that he'd once been one of the most feared men in the city. But Sophia knew, and she loved him for both the man he'd been and the man he'd become. That night, they celebrated at Bella Vista, the restaurant where their story had begun. The management had changed hands in the intervening years, but the new owners were people Marco and Sophia had helped establish in the business. The servers were employees who'd found stable work through their job placement programs. The ingredients came from suppliers who'd benefited from Marco's fair pricing policies. It was a perfect example of how they'd transformed their world, not through destruction of the old system, but through creation of something better. As they sat at the same table where Sophia had once confronted a different version of Marco, she reflected on how far they'd both traveled. The woman who'd once been afraid to speak up for herself was now running community health programs across 3 boroughs. The man who'd once ruled through fear was now building his influence through genuine respect and shared prosperity. But success brought new challenges. Other crime families, both locally and from distant cities, began to take notice of what Marco and Sophia had built. Some wanted to copy their methods. Others wanted to destroy them out of principle, viewing their approach as a threat to traditional power structures. The most serious threat came from an unexpected source. Marco's cousin Vincent, who had spent the previous 2 years building his own criminal organization in New Jersey, decided that Marco's new approach made him weak and vulnerable. Vincent began reaching out to Marco's former enemies, offering alliances based on their shared interest in returning to the old ways of doing business. The war that followed wasn't fought in the streets, but it was no less dangerous for being conducted in boardrooms and courthouses. Vincent's coalition tried to destroy Marco's legitimate businesses through regulatory challenges, tax investigations, and strategic lawsuits. They pressured Sophia's nursing school to revoke her degree based on anonymous tips about her connections to organized crime. They targeted the families who worked with Marco and Sophia's programs, threatening them with violence if they didn't withdraw their cooperation. For 6 months, it seemed like everything they'd built might crumble. Sophia watched Marco struggle with the temptation to respond the old way, to meet violence with violence and threats with overwhelming retaliation. She saw him stay up nights planning strategies that looked increasingly like the methods his father had used. The breaking point came when Vincent's people kidnapped Sophia's youngest brother on his way home from school. The 15-year-old boy was held for 3 days before being released unharmed. But the message was clear: Marco's new methods couldn't protect the people he cared about from determined enemies. Sophia found Marco in his office after her brother's safe return, staring at a loaded gun on his desk. She knew he was calculating whether the old methods might be necessary after all, whether the safety of their family required him to become the man he'd fought so hard to stop being. Instead of arguing with him, Sophia sat down across from the desk and told him a story she'd never shared before. When she was 16, she said quietly, her father had been approached by loan sharks who offered easy money to pay for her mother's first round of medical treatments. He'd refused because he understood that easy money always came with impossible interest. When the loan sharks sent men to pressure him, her father hadn't fought back with violence. Instead, he'd gone to every neighbor on their block, explained the situation honestly, and asked for help. The community response had been overwhelming. Not just financial help, but protection. The loan sharks found that their intimidation tactics didn't work in a neighborhood where everyone was watching out for everyone else. The men who'd come to threaten her father found themselves outnumbered by ordinary people who decided that protecting their neighbor was more important than avoiding trouble. Her father had won that fight not by becoming dangerous, but by proving that cooperation was stronger than coercion. Marco listened to this story, then looked down at the gun on his desk. When he looked back up at Sophia, she saw that he'd made his decision. The next day, instead of declaring war on Vincent's coalition, Marco and Sophia called a meeting. They invited representatives from every family, legitimate business, and community organization in their network. The meeting was held in the auditorium of a community college Sophia had helped fund, and more than 300 people attended. Marco stood before this crowd and did something unprecedented in the history of organized crime. He asked for help. He explained exactly what Vincent's coalition was trying to accomplish and how they planned to do it. He outlined the threats facing everyone in the room if the old system returned. And then he asked each person to decide for themselves whether the community they'd built together was worth defending. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Business owners offered financial support. Community leaders offered political connections. Former criminals who'd found legitimate work through Marco's programs offered intelligence about Vincent's operations. Students from Sophia's healthcare initiatives offered to document any violence or intimidation for legal proceedings. It wasn't an army in the traditional sense, but it was something more powerful, a network of people who'd chosen to support each other rather than submit to fear. The campaign that followed lasted another 6 months, but Vincent's coalition never had a real chance. They prepared to fight a traditional criminal organization, but instead found themselves opposed by what amounted to a grassroots political movement. Every intimidation attempt was documented and reported to authorities. Every regulatory challenge was met by lawyers funded through community donations. Every act of violence was immediately surrounded by witnesses willing to testify. Vincent's allies began switching sides as they realized that Marco's network offered them better long-term prospects than Vincent's threats. The end came not with gunfire, but with Vincent's arrest on federal racketeering charges. The evidence against him had been gathered by the same community members he'd tried to intimidate, and the prosecution was supported by victims who no longer feared retaliation. Marco didn't attend the trial, but Sophia did. She wanted to see how justice looked when it operated through law instead of violence. Vincent was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. He never threatened Marco's family again. In the months that followed, Sophia and Marco's approach was studied by law enforcement agencies, sociologists, and business schools. They'd proven that organized criminal networks could be transformed into legitimate community organizations without simply transferring the violence to different hands. Their success became a model for similar transformations in other cities. But for Sophia and Marco, the real victory was simpler and more personal. 5 years after their first confrontation in Bella Vista, Sophia Rodriguez and Marco Torino were married in a ceremony held in the community center they'd built together. Sophia's mother, fully recovered and cancer-free, walked her daughter down the aisle. Marco's uncle, who'd once warned him about becoming soft, served as his best man, having learned that strength could take many forms. The reception was attended by former enemies who'd become allies, community leaders they'd helped establish, and families whose lives had been changed by their programs. There were no bodyguards, no weapons, and no one looking over their shoulders for threats. For the first time in his adult life, Marco Torino was surrounded by people who honored him for what he'd built rather than feared him for what he could destroy. As Sophia and Marco danced their first dance as husband and wife, the song that played was the same violin music that had filled Bella Vista on the Christmas day when their story began. But now, instead of providing soundtrack to intimidation and fear, the music celebrated transformation and hope. Sophia had kept her promise to herself. She'd found a way to be strong without becoming hard. Marco had found something he'd never thought possible, a way to be powerful without being dangerous. Together, they'd proven that even the darkest stories could have bright endings, and that sometimes the most radical act of defiance was simply refusing to accept that things had to stay the way they'd always been. Their love story became a legend in their community, not because it was perfect, but because it was proof that people could change, that systems could be transformed, and that courage could take many forms. Sometimes it looked like a waitress standing up to a crime boss in front of his entire family. Sometimes it looked like that same crime boss choosing to walk away from everything he'd known rather than lose the woman who'd shown him a different way to live. But always, it looked like two people deciding that love was stronger than fear, and that the future they wanted to build together was more important than the past that had brought them to each other. Years later, When Sophia would tell this story to the young women in her community health programs, she would end with the same words that had become her personal motto. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just says no more. And sometimes, it says yes to something better. If this story has touched your heart, take a moment to like and share it with someone who needs to hear that transformation is possible. Subscribe for more stories that prove love can triumph over the darkest circumstances, and that every ending can be a new beginning if we're brave enough to write it ourselves.